Good afternoon and welcome to Community Candor. This session is entitled City Planning, Planning for Inclusive Communities, and we're very excited that you're joining us this afternoon. We've got a great panel here. I'm going to go ahead and let our distinguished speakers introduce themselves. And so I'll just ask Jermaine to tell us who you are, who you're with, and a little bit about your background.
For sure. Thank you, Renee, and the Communities First Inc. team for having me on this on the panel. Jermaine Ruffin, I'm with Invest Detroit. My background is in urban and regional planning with a specification mostly within the community and economic development space. That's something I've done for years on the state level and locally here in the city of Detroit.
Welcome. We're so glad that you could join us today, Jermaine. And Joel.
Hey everybody, my name is Joel Arnold. I'm a city planner here at Communities First. I've been working in this field for about 7-8 years now. Did some city planning work here in the city of Flint for several years, then worked in Philadelphia doing community planning at a nonprofit, and now I'm happy to be here at Communities First leading a lot of our neighborhood planning work and then also our policy advocacy work. So yeah, very happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Great to see you on this side of the discussion, Joel. Corey.
Hi, so my name is Corey Christensen. I work with Rowe Professional Services as a planning consultant. I've been in the Flint area for about 6 years now, working for a few years for the city of Flint as the zoning administrator before moving on to Rowe as a planning consultant.
Glad that you were able to join us. So great. I should introduce myself before we get started. I'm Renee Kent, Director of Special Projects here at Communities First, and have a background in community development finance for the last 18 to 20 years or so, but who's counting? And so let me introduce Communities First, the host of Community Candor. So Communities First is a nonprofit organization celebrating its 12th year. And the mission of the organization is to build healthy, vibrant communities through economic development, affordable housing, and innovative programming. And we launched Community Candor as a way to bring information and resources to the community. We've covered topics such as financial education, policy and advocacy, and equity and social justice. And so we're really excited to bring this discussion to you today. Again, the title of today's discussion is City Planning, Planning for Inclusive Communities. And this is actually the final conversation in a 4-part series about housing and city planning. Over the course of the series of conversations, we've been diving into housing and community development issues. Our first 3 conversations, which you can see on Facebook or YouTube, we focus mainly on broad outlines of housing, what types of housing there are, what do we commonly see in our communities, how does housing get built, and how to ensure housing market is equitable. So today in this final session, we want to go a bit broader and talk not only about how we manage housing, but how do we ensure that we're planning for whole communities that serve everyone. So I'm going to turn it over to Joel, who's going to provide a brief background on city planning and set the table before we get into our discussion. So go ahead, Joel. I know you've got a presentation that you're going to pull up. And while you're doing that, I just want to mention to those that have joined us, we do have a survey. We hope that you will fill that out. Let us know what you thought of today's discussion, and also share any other topics that you're interested in learning more information about. And this is a live conversation. So if you have any comments or questions, put them in the chat and we will address them while we're going. So go ahead, Joel.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll keep this brief. So we wanted to have this conversation just as a bit of a table setter for this discussion that we'll get into, so that we know some of the terms that we're talking about and what the kind of words that we're using. So when we talk about planning for communities, what we're really talking about is work trying to maximize the health, safety, and economic well-being of all people living in our communities. And it's really broad. You know, we've talked a lot about housing in this series, this conversation, we want to think about how we move around communities. How do we attract and retain thriving businesses? Jermaine talked about his work in community and economic development that really focuses on things like that. Where we want to live and opportunities for recreation, right? How's our park system? How's our trail system? And so different than some of our other conversations, while sometimes professions like architects will focus on a single building, planners have to work with residents and elected officials to try and guide the layout of an entire community, oftentimes regions. And planners will work with those organizations, those residents, and it's residents and neighborhoods that really control what happens in their own communities. And planners try and work with those folks and make recommendations on how that community should proceed. And one of the greatest challenges is to imagine what should happen to a community and how it should grow and change for 10, 15, or 20 years into the future. And so one term that we'll probably talk about a lot on this call that'll come up at least a little bit, I know there's questions that Corey will touch on, is this concept of zoning, right? And it's something that planners have used both for good and for ill in our history, and we'll kind of go over that a little bit. But what this is, it's a way that government controls the physical development of land and the kinds of uses to which every individual property can be used, right? Zoning is often why you don't see a 30-story skyscraper adjacent to a single-story, single-family house. And it's a police power of governmental bodies, that one of the powers they can use to protect the health, safety, and general welfare of people in a community. And so, this is just an example, with how zoning works, that in some places you might only be able to build a single family house, and other places it may be more mixed with tall buildings and businesses. And they're often administered by local bodies called planning commissions and zoning boards of appeals. So those are just two terms. And I do want to touch just a little bit on the history of this so that we couch the discussion in the background of what planning is. So planning in the United States is actually really only about a little over 100 years old as an actual profession. So some early laws were passed, to regulate what were called tenements. These were sort of really poorly maintained slum housing that people were really crammed into, often were filled with disease, to start to regulate the condition of those housing units. And then cities in the early 1900s began to do what are called comprehensive plans, how to sort of map out a vision for the community in the long run. And actually, there weren't any cities that had a comprehensive plan in the United States until 1909 in Chicago. And so, there wasn't a book on planning on how to actually carry it out until just around World War I. And that was the same year that there was actually the first employed city planner in the United States. The first zoning code in our country's history was in 1916 in New York City. And I had mentioned before that zoning has been used for good and oftentimes for ill. Early on, many cities actually used zoning codes to explicitly racially segregate communities, saying this was a zone for white residents, this was a zone for Black residents. And in 1917, that was ruled unconstitutional, although often zoning was still implemented to achieve that same end. And one of the reasons you see a lot of this advancement of planning in this time is up until 1920, most Americans lived sort of in rural areas, farms, and that was the first time in a census that most Americans lived in urban areas. And now it's the vast majority today. But really throughout this time, residents, neighborhood organizations, religious institutions, and more have fought for more inclusive, representative neighborhoods. And so we want to make sure that in this discussion, we touch on planning also has a history, in addition to being a tool for folks to design their own neighborhoods, to shape the future of their communities. There's also been a history of discrimination. In the 1930s, there was a federal entity that actually mapped out basically every city in the United States and color-coded neighborhoods based on whether they would insure mortgages in those neighborhoods, whether or not they thought they were good risks for banks to make loans to. And this is also where oftentimes some of the term redlining comes from. And these neighborhoods were given rates, A, B, C, D. And oftentimes the single presence of a Black resident or an immigrant family would lead to neighborhoods being listed as something that the federal government would not encourage people to invest in. And so this was carried out in the 1930s, and its legacy really still lives with us today, but many of these maps were used for decades afterwards. And so this really was some early planning encouraging disinvestment from disproportionately minority neighborhoods. And so while we saw this sort of treatment of existing neighborhoods in the middle of the 20th century, we saw an activity called urban renewal really take place after World War II. And so these are two things that I know many of our viewers on this call today are probably familiar with. Was this urban renewal era both coincided with large-scale demolition in city neighborhoods, usually with very little input from the residents there, or really no input from the residents there, to build. Sometimes it was highways, sometimes it was public housing developments, sometimes it was just speculation, clearing land for potential investment in the future. On the top, that's a before and after for anyone in Detroit who ever drives down I-375 between downtown and Lafayette Park. There was an entire neighborhood there, and it was Black Bottom, one of Detroit's densest Black neighborhoods, and it was demolished to make that highway there. And then on the bottom, in Flint, where I'm sitting right now, we had an entire neighborhood near Buick City called the St. John's neighborhood, and that was demolished for an industrial park and a highway. So an example of how some of these middle of the 20th century planning decisions really disproportionately impacted, and much like Black Bottom, St. John's was a Black neighborhood here in Flint. And so we're still living with the legacy oftentimes of these planning decisions where the voice of people living in neighborhoods was not heard, and disproportionately those voices that were ignored were the voices of people of color. And so that's something that we try and be conscious of in planning efforts today. This sort of program, Urban Renewal, really ended its federal funding in 1974, but similar things carried on for quite some time. And even today, we still see discriminatory impacts of major planning decisions. But the history of this planning is not all just communities being beaten by larger forces. It's also a story of residents, people in their neighborhoods, fighting for investment, fighting for equality, fighting for inclusivity. These are just two great examples here. The photograph on the left is from the city of Detroit, folks fighting for equal housing, wanting to be able to live in any neighborhood that they want to live in. And we didn't have the Fair Housing Act in the United States until 1968. So before then, it was often entirely legal to discriminate against people on their race, on their gender, based on their religion, disability. And on the left, there's another protest from New York City against what was called slum clearance, where folks would often demolish those entire neighborhoods for new developments that they thought were good. But it's a story of residents who oftentimes banded together and fought back, and very many times won on many of these fights. The story of planning is also a story of community organizing and a story of people making their voices heard to shape the future of their own neighborhoods. And things like this did lead to acts that still impact us today, like the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, which was passed to encourage lending in disinvested neighborhoods and reduce the impacts of redlining. So the last thing I want to touch on here is just a little bit of planning today. These are some photographs from when the city of Flint undertook its most recent comprehensive master plan, but with an idea really, as we see it here at Communities First, is an effort to plan with communities, not for communities, as was often done in the past. That piece, though, of accountability from the public remains key and essential. We know that without folks hearing back, planners hearing back about whether or not the things that they're carrying out is actually what their communities want to hear, anybody can be led astray. And so, we definitely believe that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And so this is sort of, especially at Communities First, how we see the role of planning today. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. And hopefully this helps us sort of set the table for our discussions to come.
Thank you, Joel. Definitely appreciate you putting that presentation together and sharing that background information to take us into this discussion. And so I'm going to start off with a question for Corey. I'm wondering if you can provide some insight into the laws that govern planning at the state level.
Sure. So there are two major acts that govern planning in the state of Michigan. The first act is called the Zoning Enabling Act. The Zoning Enabling Act authorizes local units of government to regulate land and to create zoning districts. So on kind of what Joel was touching on was zoning ordinances, and he had an example of a zoning map up there. That's what is authorized under the Zoning Enabling Act. It allows communities to decide certain districts and what kind of uses they want in those districts. And then the map is where they lay out where those districts are going to be located. The Zoning Enabling Act also touches on issues like grandfathering. So it provides protections for existing uses so that even if you change the zoning, an existing use can remain for a set amount of time. The other act is the Planning Enabling Act, which authorizes the creation of planning commissions who are tasked with creating master plans, which form the foundation of zoning ordinances. So master plans are supposed to be when the planning department and the municipality in general closely interacts with the public and then just establishes a 20-year vision for the community. And then that vision forms the foundation for zoning. And then those are the two major acts, but there's also minor laws that come into play, things like the Michigan Liquor Control or the various marijuana acts or the Mobile Home Commission Act. There's various things that kind of intersect, but the two major acts are the Zoning Enabling Act and the Planning Enabling Act.
Let's dig into that a little bit. So we hear about zoning and planning commissions, and can you talk a little bit more about what happens at the local level with enforcing those laws, and then share a little bit about how those two entities operate on the local level?
Sure. So I guess when it comes to enforcement, I kind of divided in my head. There's preemptive enforcement and then there's reactive enforcement that are both used to kind of establish our zoning. So the preemptive enforcement happens with review procedures. So when a development's coming into town, depending on how your zoning ordinance is written, there's a certain body that has to approve that development. The Planning Commission tends to be the body that approves more complicated developments, larger ones like factories or maybe major housing developments. So that would be the preemptive. What their role is to make sure the development is compliant with the zoning ordinance. And then there's reactive enforcement, and that's things like ticketing. So that's usually driven by neighbor complaints. So if someone is operating in a way that is inconsistent with the zoning ordinance or not in compliance with any approvals from the local municipality, oftentimes neighbors will complain. It's often an annoying nuisance. And then that's the reactive enforcement, is then you get into, you ticket them, you eventually take them to court if they don't achieve compliance. So those are kind of the two major ways we enforce zoning.
And I'm just going to throw in another question. With planning and zoning, who typically sits on these boards and commissions?
So the Planning Enabling Act and the Zoning Enabling Act outlines kind of the size of the boards and then how they're chosen. In the city of Flint, where I'm most familiar, it's divided by ward, and then the council member for each ward will appoint someone to these bodies. So they're not elected positions, they're appointed positions.
Thank you, that's helpful. So thinking about Joel's presentation, where he talked a little bit about the history of planning and decisions that were made, we know that a lot of laws were enacted to improve the impact of planning on communities, especially minority communities. But we know that those impacts are still present today, and that there's still work to be done. So Jermaine, I'm hoping that you can talk about how the planning decisions of the past have impacted our lives today.
Yeah. So just taking it back to Joe's presentation, I was glad to see the things that you highlighted, because the primary issues, that come to mind are, one, the negative impact of highways going into Black and brown communities has been, something that folks are dealing with to this day. So the 1956 Federal Highway Act still impacts us today, and some of those decisions. We'll take I-375, for instance, which is one of those highways that, destroyed a prominent Black community here in the city of Detroit. Now the conversation is, well, how do we redress that? Maybe we take out I-375 and, go get back to a neighborhood fabric there. The other piece of on the housing side, which is definitely where, we know generational wealth for a portion of our history has been built. And that's been the foundation of property ownership, has been the foundation of generational wealth in the United States for decades and centuries. And when you have those negative decisions and poor public policy that's been implemented, those impacts can last a lifetime. We're talking about having the Federal Housing Act come into play, redlining being removed. However, those were policies of the day. And so a lot of folks who lived during that lifespan didn't get an opportunity to benefit from, ownership of housing or had the access to it. And so even today, looking back, when you're talking about the transition of that some families have where they're able to pass down property or sell property to help somebody go to college or to start a business, all of those different types of things, communities, Black and brown communities have not had that opportunity to do the same. And so, in today's space, there's opportunity to, one, acknowledge those things that have happened. But I think moving forward, it's even more important to make sure that those folks who have been negatively impacted, whether it was directly, ancestrally, or however it may be, to have the opportunity to be a part of what this investment means and what these opportunities mean today.
And I know that we're going to talk a little bit more. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you mute, Jermaine? Getting some feedback there. So thank you for talking about that. I know we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in the sense of what it looks like today. And Joel, I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the major trends that we're now seeing in community planning.
Yeah, so there's definitely some big sort of shifts from, I think, a lot of the things that we saw in the past in planning. Like we kind of went through a lot of those images. There was for really decades, from kind of the 1930s until not that long ago, oftentimes in community planning, we saw big priorities placed on the movement of cars through communities, parking, sort of road width, sort of, right, the way that you build a building or a neighborhood designed around how do we move cars through it is often very different, right, from the way that we see a neighborhood that is built for people to walk through it or take public transportation, right? I think, in comparison, it's the difference between Somerset and downtown Detroit in the way that they're built, right? One is built for people to arrive by car, one is built for people to walk and take public transportation. So we've seen much more in the last decade or two a shift towards trying to get back to really the way that cities had historically always been built, which was in trying to be more dense, pedestrian friendly, make it so that if somebody wants to drive, it's certainly an option to them. But that people can also get around by using public transportation, by walking. There's obviously been a big shift in planning towards people biking and taking other alternative modes. Here in Flint, we've seen the growth of the Grand Traverse Greenway and the Flint River Trail. In Detroit, you have the Joe Louis Greenway, the Detroit Riverwalk. You see all these sort of things that are really sort of a kind of a line where the Quinder Cut that are different from older sort of planning visions of a lot of driving and transportation. But beyond that too, I think, like we had discussed in some of the previous slides, there's also been, I think, a lot more effort to center communities that in the era of urban renewal were often just seen as a slum, is what's the term that people call, to be removed or to be demolished. Right, we're not seeing really the construction of large urban highways to the same extent that we saw in the 1950s and the 1960s and in Flint, they didn't finish building 475 until the early 1980s. So really, that legacy is not that long ago, but that's really been a big shift in the way that we see planning done. And then I think another big thing beyond sort of those differences in the way that we build in transportation and a bigger focus on issues of racial justice and economic justice is also a focus on more environmental sustainability. That you see, here in Flint, our master plan is actually the subtitle of it is a master plan for a sustainable Flint. And there's a big focus in how do we zone and plan in our community for things like renewable energies? How do we plan to attract businesses that, may not necessarily be the historic sort of heavy duty industrial manufacturing, but that may do lighter manufacturing that has less environmental contaminants, right? Cleaning up our waterways, seeing some of these institutions or some of these community assets as community assets and not just kind of offshoots of industrial development. Detroit, obviously, I think probably almost more than any other city in the country has really, right, transformed the relationship between the city and its river over the last 20 years. Even what I think, Jermaine, I think it was just yesterday or 2 days ago, they did the groundbreaking on the Ralph Wilson Park on the West Riverfront. And here in Flint, right, we know that Chevy Commons, which sits along our river, was just announced and funded to become the state of Michigan's newest state park, right? A state park right in the heart of a city, accessible to residents. So I think those are some major trends that we're seeing in planning now. And then, one last thing, and Jermaine mentioned it earlier too, is, and it kind of goes back to this trying to stitch neighborhoods back together. We're seeing discussions now of, how to, as much as you can possibly right a historical wrong, right, when you build it, but how do you sort of, some of these highways that bulldoze through neighborhoods and separated people, conversations around, can we remove them? Like in Detroit, there's a conversation around how do we actually remove and eliminate I-375 that cuts off downtown from the neighborhoods to the east. And here in Flint, at Communities First, we are really actively involved in conversations around I-475 about, this highway that bulldozed through Black and brown neighborhoods like St. John's and like Floral Park. And that still to this day separates huge chunks of the city. How can we, as we are either removing these roads or rebuilding these roads, reconnect neighborhoods so that we're getting back to a lot of what is a really a more traditional way of building a city? So I think sometimes it's funny, but it seems like a lot of the things that we are doing as far as the physical way that cities are built is very much sort of just trying to go back to the way that we used to do them before urban renewal. So we present ourselves as very creative with these ideas like walkability and density, when that's really just the way that cities were built almost for most of our history until, the 1930s. So those are definitely some big trends.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I want to sit on that point for a minute that you made about the trends around more environmentally friendly communities, more walkable communities. We see a lot of new bike lanes coming into communities, park spaces, green spaces. We know that during the pandemic, people were looking for more ways to connect with outdoors and nature. But even still, living in a community that has been built around automobiles for decades and decades and decades, there's a lot of work that needs to be done within the mindset, I think, of communities, because I still drive past those bike lanes.
Yeah,
right?
I think Jermaine made the point earlier too, that we see, right, a lot of this planning stuff that we're doing, this is, some sort of like longer term thinking, some longer term visioning, right? Like a master plan, or maybe Corey made the point, where like a master plan, right, is like 20 years. So, right, when you do a lot of this planning work, we're thinking, 20 years down the line, 40 years down the line, 50 years down the line. So, every little project in theory should add up to a larger whole. And we spent 70 years investing in really auto-centric infrastructure, so we're certainly not going to change it in 5.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference between the previous approach to planning was planning for people, right? Like it was very much we're in the office, we're the experts, we're thinking about this, and this is how we believe we can connect communities or maximize effectiveness of transportation in different areas. And with Joel saying urban planning is pretty much a young profession, if you could say 100 years or so is young, but it's relatively a young profession. So you've had all of these ills and these bad public policy decisions being made, and now you have this era of planning that I think that comes into the frame of now we're planning with. This is not something that you get to just plan for my community and make these things happen. You have to plan with us. And hopefully, we're going to get to a space and continue to be in a space where we are redressing some of these, past, racist public policy things that were implemented and are still impacting us today. So I think there's that opportunity now for folks to be more engaged in the process than ever before. And I think those environmental outcomes or housing outcomes will be better for it.
And thank you, Jermaine. So that's a good segue into this next question. Thinking about righting historical wrongs, and thinking about creating a more equitable society. And this question is for everyone, so please feel free to jump in. How are these efforts making progress towards creating a more equitable society? The we planning, the righting of wrongs. What are you seeing, and what are your comments on that?
Well, I'll take the first stab at it. I think the focus on sustainability of our plans and thinking more of present day and moving into the future, what it should look like is key. I think the second part of this is being intentional about calling those things out that happened in the past, so they are not repeated, and that you're intentionally setting up a system in partnership with the communities that you're serving to further ensure that those things don't happen again, right? So I think being intentional about the actions of addressing those issues are extremely important. And the planning efforts in, say, like the city of Detroit, what happened in Flint as well, that was, I happened to be a part of that a little bit, where they were really in every community. They had hundreds of meetings to talk to people about what they think their community should look like, and what did they identify as the benefits of living in their community, so that those folks can be a part of that discussion in a very meaningful way. Those are things that have to happen, and I think that inclusion part is the beginning of that process. But putting resources and planning behind that is how you can make it happen.
I guess I don't know if we're making progress towards an equitable society, but I hope so. And what gives me hope is that when I'm doing working with my clients, I'm seeing a broad-based concern about housing and housing affordability, and that gives me a lot of hope, because it's not just urban. I'm seeing it in my rural communities, I'm seeing it in my suburban, and I'm seeing it in my urban. Whenever I'm working on a master plan or a zoning ordinance, the primary concern is, are we building our community in a way that is affordable for people to come to? And so there's a lot of interest now in more diverse types of housing beyond just single family, which in a lot of ways contributed significantly to segregation. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, and I mean, I would echo sort of, both what Jermaine and Corey said here, as well as, to kind of comment on, since for everybody watching this, I think there's much more of a focus in amongst city planners and amongst city planning as departments or professionals or whomever in doing this, but that, I think the space that this sort of now, like Jermaine was saying, not planning for people, but planning with people, also gives those community organizations, resident groups, the space to organize and advocate for that inclusivity and a way to actually shape that process moving forward. In the past, if a large regional planner decided that they were going to bulldoze your neighborhood to put in a highway, well, they were going to bulldoze your neighborhood to put in a highway, and we lost a lot of great communities through those mistakes. And today, I would just encourage people that, the way to make sure that we're building these equitable, inclusive communities where we can have affordable housing and where we can have integrated neighborhoods, and reduce some of the really painful segregation that we still have in our metro areas, is by people getting involved and making their voices heard, right? And while planners do a lot of work and planning departments do a lot of the work, a lot of these major decisions wind up with elected officials, right? And elected officials listen to their voters, and so the power and really all of this rests with people being engaged and involved and putting pressure on the people who have that ultimate decision-making authority to make inclusive decisions. So don't rely on planners, as a profession to do that. At the end of the day, that's really going to come from grassroots organizations organizing and making sure that the people that they elect into office know that these things are important to them.
Absolutely, Joel. And we're definitely going to talk a little bit more about that when we do some story sharing later. But I'm hoping that we can jump into some more specific examples of what's happening in Flint and Detroit. And so, Corey, wondering if you can share a little bit about the current planning efforts in Flint and what kind of initiatives are being led there.
So I can really only speak to the zoning side of things because that's where I have experience with the city of Flint. But right now, our biggest push is getting a new zoning ordinance adopted. It's an entire rewrite of the zoning laws in the city of Flint. The current zoning laws were written in 1974. They're wildly out of date. They're wildly inconsistent with the values and reality of our current community in Flint. So in 2013, the city of Flint adopted a new master plan. It actually won awards for its public engagement. It's reached out hundreds and hundreds of public engagement sessions. They finally adopted this new master plan in 2013. That I think we touched on a bit earlier, but it calls for things like sustainability, social equity. It touches on all the concerns that are now at the forefront of the conversation. And so what happened then from there is the Planning Commission wanted to actually put that master plan into practice. So they drafted a zoning ordinance and adopted it in 2017, but it doesn't come into effect unless the city council adopts it. And so ever since then, the planning department, various people, myself have been pushing and trying to get city council to adopt it because I think it'll do a lot for the city of Flint in terms of progressing equity. It expands significantly the way people can develop their properties, the number of uses that we can allow in our communities, the types of housing. So that's the biggest push right now at the city of Flint.
Well, we want to know what's going on in Detroit, Jermaine. So can you talk about the planning efforts there, initiatives being led, and kind of trends we're seeing in Detroit?
Yeah, there's some great stuff happening here in the city of Detroit. I think it starts with folks kind of coming together and partnering to make things happen. And so I think one example of that is the Strategic Neighborhood Fund and Planning process as a collaboration with the city of Detroit, philanthropic partners, and our organization at Invest Detroit, where we are focusing in on 10 different neighborhoods where there is a strong commercial corridor that the city owns property in, and partners can come to the table and figure out how are we intentional about the investments that are taking place there, but informed by the community that surrounds those commercial corridors and areas. And so that's one part. I think what the Detroit, the Riverfront Conservancy, as was mentioned earlier, is doing of connecting the riverfront from Belle Isle all the way to the West Riverfront Park and other parts of the city of Detroit is amazing, because you can play off with the Joe Louis Greenway. That is also an infrastructure improvement that's coming to the city that further gets to the point that we were talking about earlier about this connectivity around the city. So those 10 neighborhoods, the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, the Joe Louis Greenway are three planning items that I think are amazing. And it's great to see, happening here in the city of Detroit. One thing that I do want to mention, fairly that I think is fairly important. One is how do we, pay for or finance these things? And so I think that collaboration is extremely important, especially in an environment where, maybe the federal government or other organizations that might have chipped in with more money in the past just are not the same players as they used to be. And so it's really incumbent upon neighborhoods and communities to rally together, their resources, but to also leverage that with like-minded, mission-driven partners to make these things happen. And so that's where I see the biggest opportunity and where the most improvement has happened within the city of Detroit. And having a master plan that's something that goes unrecognized by a lot of folks, but for us planners, we know how important that can be, mostly because it's a comprehensive community plan, and you don't get that everywhere. You can update the zoning, Zoning here in Detroit, I think the last time it was really fully updated and adopted by the city was maybe like in the 70s as well as the master plan being done back in that time also. A lot has changed. So you're talking about fitting these great ideas that we have today, like a high-speed Wi-Fi into a dial-up system. It doesn't really match the way that it should, but we know through continuing this conversation that we're having today, folks in the neighborhoods coming together, we can hopefully make a difference and change the system all the way around. But that's the opportunity that exists.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, Jermaine. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. There are a ton of planning efforts going on throughout the city of Detroit, some being led by the Strategic Neighborhood Fund that you mentioned, SNF, supported by the city of Detroit. But speaking of the master plan, where are things with getting that updated, doing the total overhaul?
That's a great question. I think our we have a new planning director here in the city of Detroit, Antoine Bryant, who's come on and hopefully under his leadership and working with the mayor and the new city council that has come on, that's a conversation that can be robust and move forward. It's not something that there's an update that I could talk about or share today, but it's definitely I know is on the radar of the city to investigate whether that's something that we need to make happen sooner rather than later, or if a collection of strategies and around the Strategic Neighborhood Fund continuing to move forward is the action that we're going to be taking. But I do think that master plan piece, for whether it's the city of Detroit or any city, is a great place to start and evaluate, because it demands that you as a planner or your organization engage a wide range of people. And when you do that, those ideas typically come to the floor, and issues and challenges that you may have not been aware of will certainly rise to the top in those conversations and help you be thoughtful about the tools and resources that you bring to resolve those challenges.
So let's talk about challenges and issues in equitable community planning today. Is there anything that anyone on the panel wants to highlight, other than what's already been raised at this point?
I did want to hit on, what Corey mentioned earlier about this issue of affordable housing. And we talk about building equitable communities. I think sometimes planning can get almost too caught up in the form of a place or the build of a place. But what we've seen very often is a lot of places that wind up being built to be very walkable or very pedestrian friendly with very nice architecture. And then an apartment costs $6,000 a month to rent. And so it's like you've got the builder, right? You've got the form, what we say we're advocating for, and then it just tends to be filled by kind of folks who have way more means than the average person, right? And that can really kill a community too. If you don't have the diversity of experiences, it's not, it's racial diversity, it's economic diversity, it's national diversity, right? Communities with immigrants and refugees are oftentimes incredibly thriving communities, but often it's much more affordable. And so I think one big thing that we're seeing now is there's a traditional fight in planning and in development in communities between what are often called NIMBYs, not in my backyards, right? Folks who often oppose new development or oppose change or, just want nothing built in their community, versus what we see in sort of a more newer sort of rising movement of folks called YIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard, right? How do we build places? Because, we see this oftentimes if a community is growing and is adding more jobs or seeing economic development, it'll need to add more housing, right? I think what we think of oftentimes as some of the most expensive communities in the country, and don't quote me on this, but I know in places like San Francisco, which, the right next to Silicon Valley, home to an immense amount of wealth and economic growth, a lot of those communities, it's added, I think the statistic I saw was 1 new housing unit for every 13 new jobs it added. So it should be unsurprising then when a 1-bedroom apartment costs $3,500. And so, if we don't really address sometimes just some of these issues around cities change, right? And if economic growth often comes with new development and new construction, you still want to engage communities with that, make sure that it's shaped by the people that live there as well. What we also don't want is hoarding economic opportunity. And we see that a lot when folks, try and keep new folks who might want to move into their neighborhoods out, that those places that may be close to employment or close to public transportation or close to amenities, schools, daycares, restaurants, those can be hoarded sometimes by people who have means because they're the only ones that can afford to pay the rents or pay the mortgages of living in that kind of community. So I think that real sort of NIMBY fight and making sure that, when we're building affordable housing, we're not saying, okay, this is the part of town that we build affordable housing in, but that we're making sure that we're doing it everywhere is a really big challenge that I think we're seeing right now. We see it in our work communities first of ensuring that we actually have equity everywhere and don't repeat the mistakes of the past, which was often isolating low-income communities, separating them from services, separating them from job opportunities, which does not work, and we know does not work.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. Jermaine, did you want to say something? It looked like you were reaching.
Yeah, I was just going to say I saw a great question come in regards to when the other, because there's 100+ neighborhoods in the city of Detroit, and there's 10 that are being addressed by this particular strategy. And the question is, when will the remaining neighborhoods be addressed and planned? That's something that I don't have an answer for, but I do have a thought to share on that. And one is that I think that there isn't all neighborhoods need to have a strategy and a plan that's informed by the community that is there. And I also think that there is a tendency for us, because this is how development has worked, for it to be top led and pushed down. And I think that there are certain areas where, there's property ownership by the city or by, various organizations where that strategy may make sense for these particular corridors, but in areas where they are not currently active, my encouragement has always been for residents and like-minded organizations to come together and say, look, this is what we want, before somebody comes in and tries to provide a plan for what your neighborhood should look like and what it should be. And I think that that's one of the things that urban planners, or folks who are in the planning space, I don't think encourage enough, because it's like, oh, well, we can't, stuff should move unless we're involved in it kind of deal. But I disagree with that. I think that folks have, a great understanding and idea of their neighborhood. They might not have the resources to do that. And so I think that's where, being able to understand what resources might be necessary or technical assistance might be necessary by those community organizations who are active in those neighborhoods, to say, this is what we need. This is the process that we've been through, and here are the voices at the table that can help us implement what we want to see, is really powerful. And I think that that's something that we need to see more of, especially in communities like ours. This is something that that has to happen, in my opinion. Sorry, Renee, I took a little longer than anticipated, but that's my answer.
No, I'm very glad that you said that, because I wanted to sit on this point for a minute related to community voice and advocacy, and the power in communities coming together and speaking to the powers that be about their community, the needs of the community, the desires of the community, and really advocating for what they want in those spaces and how assets should be developed. There's a lot of power in that community voice, especially a collective community voice, as it relates to planning, zoning, development. And I'll just share a quick story in my neighborhood, which is a very active neighborhood of community residents who are organized and very passionate about the community. And there are a number of examples of how they've come together for and against things that will impact the community. I'm proud to say that they are in support of affordable housing in the community. So that's NIMBYism hasn't been an issue. But there's a manufacturing plant that wants to locate within 5 miles of the community. And the neighborhood has truly organized to go against that plan because of the environmental effects that it'll have on the neighborhood. It just doesn't make sense to put that type of facility that close to a neighborhood of residents. And so they're still fighting that battle, but they've made a lot of progress, and it's only because of their collective voice. And so I'd like to open it up to our panelists. If you have any stories that you'd like to share regarding some interesting community planning efforts that you've been involved in or have seen happen in your respective communities.
I guess I can go first. So my my answer might sound kind of silly, but it had an impact on me. I was working on a master plan for a small rural village up in the Thumb. They brought me in because they wanted to update their master plan. They're kind of a community that was in decline, a lot of businesses leaving, a lot of residents leaving. As I'm meeting with the planning commission, the only thing that they are interested in is bringing back the McDonald's that had left their community 10 years ago. And that was the only thing. Month after month, I'm going to these meetings and talking to them about their community, and they can't stop looking backwards at what left and how to bring it back. And so what I learned out of that is that a lot of times people get caught up looking backwards, and it can be part of our role as planners to turn people around and look forward and help them prepare for the future, and maybe help them see that things can come to their community that are new. So that was my interesting story.
Yeah, and I think I know that in I was fortunate when I was living in the city of Philadelphia to work on. There's a little bit of feedback. Jermaine, do you mind muting your line? Good, thank you. So it was just when I was working in Philadelphia, I was lucky enough to work for a nonprofit that we did a lot of community planning in a neighborhood that had a lot of immigrants and refugees from Southeast Asia. And so we did a neighborhood plan for this neighborhood that was incredibly diverse and had a whole bunch of different stories from a long-standing Black community that had for a long time been ignored by the planning process to communities that were Italian and Irish in origin, to recent arrivals that were from Cambodia and Laos and Nepal and Burma. And so we built this coalition of folks to do this neighborhood planning process. But when we were doing the planning process, we had to print all of our outreach materials in 12 different languages, and we had to hold our meetings in about 6 different languages in order to make sure that we were actually engaging everybody around a common vision for this community that we could all then advocate for and go to the city planning commission or the city council to really push for. And that process, it was challenging. All these easy things that you do, holding a community meeting, all of a sudden when you hold a community meeting, you need 5 translators, or you need to hold 5 separate meetings in a distinctive language, and also understanding the background of where people came from, right? The neighborhood preferences of somebody who just came to the United States maybe 5 years ago from a very challenging experience as a refugee is often very different from somebody's preferences who may have lived in the neighborhood of their family for 70, 80 years. And how do you sort of bring folks together to realize that through collective action and their collective voice, that there's a lot more that makes us similar than that makes us different. And so that process was really fascinating. I loved getting to work on that. And I learned much more from the neighbors that I was working with than anybody learned from me. I mean, it was, such a great example of a diverse community coming together to advocate for its long-term interests, which really were around, affordable housing and public investment, like supporting neighborhood schools and infrastructure. But also there were gentrification pressures coming in from neighborhoods to the north that hadn't really quite reached the neighborhood yet, but were very obviously on their way. And so, we really worked on, Jermaine was saying, of like, how do you sort of do this before someone shows up in your neighborhood and all of a sudden the rent goes up 50% or the rent goes up 100% and folks are priced out? We were really working on trying to beat that advancing increase in cost of living and trying to come up with a vision for the community that we could then advocate for to the council and to the mayor and to the planning commission before those pressures came. And it was a really great experience.
For me, I've been in this work for a long time, and one of the things that I'm grateful to see is something that a lot of folks in my community have been advocating for some time, which is the opportunity to rebuild your own community. Taking an opportunity to be a part of revitalizing our own neighborhoods. And I think the inspiration for that, for me, at least over the last couple of years, there wasn't a more, there was Jonathan Pacheco Bell, who's a friend of mine out in LA, who focuses on embedded planning as a planning practice where, he's in the community. You're not at your desk making these decisions. You're actually out in the neighborhood talking to folks, walking to spaces and getting a very good feel and understanding of the cultural significance, what these particular changes you're suggesting could possibly have on this neighborhood. I think that's a part of it. The second is, Nipsey Hussle, I think brought it to the forefront, and he wasn't the first, but there's been many. But I think it resonated with me more so over the last couple of years because of what he was doing in his community, coming from the neighborhood. He started focusing on parks. He started focusing on, business owning real estate within his community and giving that back and providing jobs to the folks in the neighborhoods. And this is something that I'm seeing being done here in Detroit, by folks like Rod Hardiman, Richard Hosey, like guys that are committed to their community, who are not only looking at, the generational wealth for themselves and their family, but also for Detroiters as a whole. And so you need developers, you need community members who are thinking in that framework, who want to be a part of this work moving forward. And last but not least, I just want to give a shout out to some programs that I think are being duplicated in other areas to promote that type of focus, which is like, the Capital Impact Equitable Developers Initiative, and also building community value. Those types of programs where you're taking folks from the neighborhood, giving them the tools and resources and knowledge so that they themselves can say, you know what, I'm not going to wait for somebody to come to me with a plan. This is what the plan I'm going to develop with my neighbors, and here's what we're about to do, and actually making it happen. And so those are the things that I'm excited about, that keep me inspired in the work that I'm doing, and I hope can resonate and be an example for folks interested in this type of work, within the state of Michigan, but across the country.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. As we get ready to wrap up, I just want to ask our panelists. So we've talked about an overview of planning. We've talked about zoning. We've talked about the history of planning across the country. We've talked about things here in Michigan, and then more specifically in Flint and Detroit. We've talked about the present, what's currently happening. And I'm just wondering if each of you could just briefly share, in a perfect world, what would you like to see planning evolve to? And maybe I shouldn't say perfect world, because we can make whatever happen. We can make whatever come to be if we work towards it and push for it. So, where would you like to see planning be or evolve to in the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I'd really like to see it, continue sort of working to evolve to being a venue that both brings sort of a knowledge of some of the things we talked about, the way that a built environment can be built to make it easier for folks of all income backgrounds to be around. So, still pushing as a profession for things like walkable communities, transit-friendly communities, bike-friendly communities. But also, as much as possible, I think removing ourselves from a lot of the more technocratic worldviews around planning. There's oftentimes, I think, professions will use like technocratic terms and things that people don't understand as a way of like keeping their own power or keeping their own privilege in a situation. So I'd love to see, planning continue to be a profession that tries to be accessible, to be open, and to use the skills that it has to empower residents to realize their own political power, their organizing power, and their voice to shape things in their own neighborhoods.
And if I could build off that, what I am most interested in, I'm hoping that there's some innovation and new ideas in, is how to engage the public in a much more meaningful way. Because I think it's very superficial how it's done now, and it's just not working. Too often, I'll be at a commission meeting for a new development, and the public comes in, they might speak for or against it, but it's the first time they're actually interacting with the process, and they don't understand the process, and it's very frustrating for them. So I would like to see a way that planning can communicate better with the public, not be so technocratic, not be so intimidating, and hopefully engage people through every step of the process instead of just at certain points. Now we're doing our public engagement. It should be just embedded in the entire planning process.
I would second what Joel and Corey has said, and then for me it's pretty to the point, which is I want urban planning to be representative of the neighborhoods that we're serving. Right. I think that there's definitely a need and a desire on my part and other colleagues who are in this space who recognize that urban planning is 3% of the urban planning field is made up of Black and brown people, and that's unacceptable to me, especially with the impact that it has on neighborhoods and cities and the future of our country and our communities. Like, we need to be involved actively, both on the professional side, but also on the community engaged side of understanding, well, what are the principles of urban planning and how does it impact me? And so, I've taken that as kind of a personal mission to say, you know what, we have to raise the voices of the folks in the neighborhoods and make those connections with folks who like them are doing this work elsewhere, right? You might not be aware of it, but what these folks are doing in other spaces is important to you because you could duplicate that as opposed to recreating the wheel to solve challenges that we all have in our community with affordable housing, transportation, infrastructure, all of the things that are struggles and challenges in neighborhoods that take resources. It also takes that rallying point and folks being reflective of who you are, understanding where you're coming from in a real way. And so I that would be something that I would love to see is that increase in the field.
Thank you all. I think we can take a lot from this conversation, especially thinking about who places are designed for, how they're designed, why they're designed that way, but more importantly, the impact that you can have on making changes to the design of communities and places. So thank you to our panel for joining us today. Thank you for the audience for tuning in. Please check out our past episodes if you haven't already. And just a note, we have a survey that we would like you to fill out, please, so that we can know if this information is helpful and what other additional information we can bring to the community. And I believe we're giving a prize away. It says we're giving a prize away. So even more incentive to fill out that survey. Take care and have a wonderful day. Thank you.